Eccoci. Salve a tutti. Oggi la conversazione di oggi sarà su gas e petrolio russi, cosa sta succedendo con questi prodotti nel mondo, come la guerra e come gli ultimi anni hanno influito sul commercio di idrocarburi russi. La conversazione sarà in inglese perché abbiamo anche stavolta un ospite d'onore che è estremamente competente nel tema, che è Andon Pavlov. Con noi abbiamo anche Gabriele Fabozzi, che già conoscete grazie al lavoro della redazione ucraina. Vi lascio alla sigla e poi alla nostra conversazione.
Bene, grazie Alexei. I think you can switch to English now. Hello, Andon. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, here Andon Pavlov is a good friend and ex-colleague of mine, based here in Vienna, and he's a refining manager at Kpler. Andon, maybe you want to give us a brief introduction of what Kpler is, who you are, and what you focus on mostly, or what you've been focusing on mostly lately.
Sure. So Kpler is a leading data provider in the cargo tracking space, focusing. First started as a ship tracking company, counting barrels, counting all kinds of commodities. The last couple of years, it's been expanding inorganically by acquiring a couple of companies. So today is the biggest player in the area. And one of these acquisitions essentially was the company that Gabriele and I used to work, JBC Energy, which was focused exclusively on research and analysis. So the acquisition of JBC Energy was essentially the launch of Kpler Insight. And in the Kpler Insight, I'm essentially doing the same job, focusing on refinery margins, operations, product rate, crude rate, all kinds of tax changes, reasons behind that, explaining all these factors and putting together forecasts for our clients. I've been involved in that for a little more than 6 years now. And one of the focus areas that I've been covering over the last 4 years and something has been Russia. So I think I can be a little bit useful to that conversation.
Yeah, indeed. That's what we're hoping. Indeed, but we're sure. Yeah, I mean, I think since in our work we've been covering the let's say the Russian invasion of Ukraine since February of last year. It becomes quite important to put kind of the consequences and the actions that the European Union and other countries have set forth to contest this on the economic side. And of course, this has repercussions on the Russian economy. And we're curious essentially to clarify some things on some details on what has been going on. We thought that it might be worth just for to get everybody on the same page, to get our viewers kind of more familiar with the topic at hand, to maybe do a brief overview of kind of what the Russian oil and gas macro system looks like. What are the main products that come out of Russian refineries? What are the main markets that Russia serves, and how this has changed from before to after the war? Alexei, if we can share these slides, I've prepared a few slides.
Yep.
This is yes. So
here we are.
Here we are. So viewers, this is a kind of a schematic of how a refinery works. It looks complicated, but we will focus, I guess, on a few particular products which are mostly relevant for the discussion we're about to have on Russia. Andon, of course, if I say anything that is out of the blue, correct me if I'm wrong. So here we have crude oil coming in, and it's heated up in a furnace, and there is a process called atmospheric distillation. This is here the vapors of the crude oil rise in this column. This is essentially a big chimney, and from each section of this distillation tower, different sections or let's say different cuts of what used to be crude gets distilled into liquids or sometimes even gases. What we're mostly interested in these cases are, in the case of Russia, are diesel. This is one of the main products that diesel and gas oil, which Russia has been a leading exporter in the world scene for many years. We have then heavy fraction, the lighter fractions. So naphtha, in this case, will clear up what each part is, just to get our viewers acquainted with that. We have then what's called fuel oil, and then finally what we call vacuum gas oil, or VGO for short. Here on the side, I've made a brief kind of overview of what the main uses of all these products are. So on the left here you have the products, and on the right you have the main use. For gasoline, diesel, we're talking clearly about fuel, but also some secondary processing, which maybe Andon you can talk a bit more later on. We have naphtha, so one of the lighter sections of the distilled outputs, where most of the output is used for either destined to the petrochemical sector, so everything that involves chemicals of all sorts that can then get used for industrial purposes, or consumer plastics, or even industrial plastics. And then we have, again, further secondary processing, and in particular what's called petrol blending. We have then fuel oil, which is one of the heavier fractions coming out of the distillation tower and further processing, mainly used as tanker fuel, so for sea lane transportation, and in some cases power generation, especially in some especially countries in the Middle East and Asia. We know this to be the case. And then we have vacuum gas oil, which has, at least from my understanding, kind of a special relevance in the Russian refining ecosystem, because again, it's used for secondary processing, and it can be a valuable resource in case one has the, let's say, proper equipment in a refinery to process this stuff. So yeah, Andon, maybe you can we can comment a bit on like what. So I was mostly interested in the secondary processing part, because it's clear that Russia has been a major exporter of diesel and of gas oil over the years. But in terms of secondary processing, from what I understand, we're talking about products which cannot be fully refined in the Russian ecosystem, and that need to be exported elsewhere to be converted into finished products. This used to be the case, of course, before the war, but we were wondering essentially how this has changed since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent actions that have been taken by the European Union and the G7 countries to kind of hit Russian revenues in this sense.
Yeah, and if I can, a brief addendum to the question, which I hope will provide a broader picture to our viewers. Also, a brief description, Andon, if you want, on what Russia exports and what and produces, and what it does not export and produce, and also where. So this is the first topic, I guess.
Okay, understood. Just to be clear, the secondary processing, well, it's a little bit of a tricky part. So I'm just going to start with the basics, and then we go into secondary processing, because that's the more logical way to approach the question, I think. So as you can imagine, Russia is one of the top 3 crude producers in the world. And roughly it processes around half of the produced crudes domestically. So the produced crude, as Gabriele has shown us on the chart, ends up as different products, and these different products end up as either exports or consumed domestically. Just as a side note, because Russia is a big crude exporter, it's also like crude export revenues are a big chunk of the Russian state budget in its own right. But we'll get to that in a second. So what Russia is essentially long of and short of, this is a bit of a professional jargon, but essentially being long of something means that you produce more than you consume. And short means the other way around. You need to import something. In that case, what Russia exports, well, Russia technically exports everything. So Russia's resource base is on this side of predominantly on this side of the Urals Mountains, which constitutes the big part of the Urals stream. Why is this relevant? Because Urals is a medium crude, medium sour crude. And we'll get to that in a second, but it is important to realize that, like, much so that the distribution of the population in Russia is being mimicked by the distribution of the refinery system. And the refinery system is like 90% or even more concentrated on this side of the Ural Mountains. So the vast majority of Russia in terms of territory is essentially an exports, like a resource export oriented in terms of hydrocarbons. So Russian crude and Urals in particular is medium and sour. Medium and sour gives you, generally speaking, high yields of middle and bottom of the barrel products. This constitutes fuel, video, depending on your equipment, diesel. And if you are complex enough, meaning if you have the capacity to process more of this crude, then you can go into lighter molecules, lighter products being gasoline, LPG, naphtha, or whatever, or you can make some use of the petrochemicals. So why am I starting so far? Well, because it's important to understand what Russia can and what Russia cannot produce. So Russia can produce a lot of middle distillates being gasoil and jet. It can produce sufficient amount of gasoline, but not too much. It is stuck with a lot of naphtha because it does not have enough capacity to process the naphtha domestically and turn it into either petrochemical products or gasoline in a reformer. It also has more VGO, as Gabriele pointed out, secondary feedstock product than it can make good use of. And that pretty much sums it up. In terms of what Russia is long of, a lot of gasoil. It's one of the major gasoil exporters, so gasoil diesel exporters in the world. It's also no coincidence that last summer has been very unusual in the sense that, like, Europe realizing that it cannot have access to Russian material anymore, sent margins for diesel for refiners. Margins for different products are called cracks in professional language. So sent cracks to very high levels that they remained in this environment for until a couple of weeks ago. What else is Russia long of? Technically, it's long of everything. It's long of fuel, which is a problem because fuel is usually traded at a discount to crude. So essentially, for every barrel produced, you are erasing part of your refining margin. It's long of gasoil. It's a little bit long of diesel, but not too much. Seasonally, it is long gasoline, stuck with naphtha, stuck with VGO, and LPG. So why is this relevant? Because, as you can imagine, as much as the Russian domestic market plays a role, Russia in itself for international markets is a lot more important in terms of exports, and that's why it's been one of the hot topics of the past months, that what's going to happen with Russian gasoil and diesel exports. And back to the topic of like how European policies have been affecting that stream. Well, it's a very complex question, if you will, because Europe, or G7, if you will, cannot afford to completely destroy the Russian export stream. It's a little bit of a prisoner's dilemma, if you will, because if Russian exports are completely cut off from international markets, then the world as a whole is going to become so tight in terms of availability of diesel that it will be stuck at record high levels for quite some time, which is a problem for European economies in their own right, because they're very diesel heavy. You need diesel for all the industrial freight, you need diesel for industrial operations, and also around half of the European fleet is still running on diesel, and commercial diesel, so ultra low sulfur diesel, which Russia is essentially one of the key suppliers of. So what Europe in the price cap essentially was supposed to do, and to a degree successfully so, was to deprive the Russian state budget from enough revenues from exports of clean products. Clean products are everything in this distillation tower that you saw above fuel, so that includes gasoil, gasoline, and so on. What the aim of the cap was, to a degree, to be able to hamper Russian state budget revenues, whilst also keeping Russian material floating into international markets. And what we've seen since the launch of the export ban in the European Union is that Russian exporters have been essentially left alone to export to wherever they wanted to outside of the European Union, and that's roughly what they did. So they essentially displaced other players in places like North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, Middle East, in terms of gasoil. So the global gasoil balance as a whole was not as tight as it would have been if Russia was completely cut off from international markets, which I think was a target in its own right, because if it were the case that Russia was completely cut off, then, as I said, this would have been a much bigger blow to the global economy, and in particular, because Europe as a whole is short of diesel. So Europe needs to import diesel regardless of the season, regardless of the economic condition. Europe is structurally short diesel, so it needs to be able to have access to this material, to these barrels. So not having prices at insanely high levels was paramount for European policymakers, which was the target, and to a degree it's been achieved, because all the Russian material that has flown into places like Africa or Latin America has essentially displaced material from elsewhere, material that is now being fed into the European system. So it was a little bit of a weird triangulation with the aim of hampering Russia's state budget revenues, which arguably has achieved its goal, because Russian state budget revenues from oil and gas exports for the first quarter of this year were quite low. They believe they fell by around 40% year on year, which is quite a blow to an economy that is so heavy on export of hydrocarbons.
In Q1 this year,
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Well, I mean,
whatever the situation is, I mean, if you decide to buy the Russian central bank stories, if you decide to buy, because like Russia has become a lot more similar to China in the sense that like everything that goes out in terms of statistics is probably 30% true, 70% state propaganda. So you have to take everything with a pinch of salt. But even the central bank is admitting that like state revenues are suffering, and they're suffering a lot. And it's logical for them to be suffering, because Russia, because of the export ban, is forced to export all products at a discount. So selling at a discount of, say, like $5 per barrel with a margin right now sitting at $15 or $10, let's say, roughly speaking, leaves you with like much less attractive refining margins as otherwise conditions would have dictated. So the state budget revenue, depending on the final price as per the documentation, is suffering. What is not suffering is Russian majors' revenues. Why? Because the insurance and freight ban that was imposed, essentially what the result was that all the Russian majors created shell companies, or more like started employing them, because these companies were set up like 10, 15 years ago. If you check their websites, they look ridiculous, like something put out by an intern like in one afternoon. And yet these are like one of the biggest shipping companies at the moment in terms of volumes, which essentially means only one thing. It's like Rosneft, Gazprom Neft, and and Lukoil, like the big guns in the Russian downstream and upstream sector, have internalized the operations. So they are covering, together with Chinese and Indian banks and so on and so forth, they're covering insurance. They're forcing buyers to work with their own shippers, and they are increasing the price of shipping so as to make up for the change in the price. So if they're selling at minus $5 per barrel, they're telling Indian counterparts, you can buy it, but you have to pay us, instead of $1 for the freight, you have to pay us $3. So the de facto discount for India and China is not as strong as official prices would suggest. Nevertheless, it's still there. It's still they're still making a good deal, like financially. So it's no problem. The problem is that all these revenues are going into like these shell companies that are registered in like Switzerland, Cyprus, whatever. Don't pay much taxes there, as you can imagine, and essentially end up in private hands.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you again. There is still some sounds, some scratch sounds from your mic. I'll give you some time to check. In the meanwhile, I will ask my second question. Thank you, firstly, for these very broad overview. You touched a lot of topics, but may I ask you to start your overview from a little bit before, because the major media outlets are saying, especially for the first part of 2023, that Russia is losing money, that Russia is earning less money year on year. But let's not forget that during 2022, Russia had a giant, or I think still large budget surplus thanks to its hydrocarbon export money. So I'll ask you to start the overview from at least 2021, when COVID was still there. And so what happened in this period of those last 3 years, so 2021, 2022, and 2023, to help us have a more correct interpretation of the numbers today?
Sure. How's my sound now?
Good, thank you.
All right. I hope it's better.
Sounds good. Yes.
So 2021 was not an easy year for a lot of places. Russia was having somewhat of a good year, for what it's worth. Gas exports were pretty high. Gas prices were relatively elevated. Nord Stream 1 was running at full speed. Gas exports were doing fine. Refinery operations were pretty robust. They've been investing in modernization for that period. Business as usual for the most part, I would say. Like 2021 was a relatively good year for the Russian state budget. State finances, inflation was a little bit high, which is usually a signal for either a structural problem or economic growth. And I would tend to think that it was more of an economic growth story rather than a structural problem for Russia itself. So I think 2021 as a reference year was relatively fine for Russia. There have been a lot of rumors around what's going to happen, or unclarities, if you will, like what's going to happen with the downstream industry. Will there be enough state revenues to justify the modernization program, and so on and so forth? But nothing major outside of the usual. That's 2021. 2022 started off on a very strong note. January and February refinery runs in Russia were very high. They were essentially running at close to nameplate capacity, which is pretty impressive. China was suffering or starting to suffer already from COVID coming back, so that was a bit of a concern for the global economy. But in general, like Europe was willingly buying. In the US, of course, were willingly buying Russian products. The Middle East was doing its own thing. There was this price war with Saudi Arabia briefly in 2021 that essentially did not really have much effect, I would argue, on the Russian state budget revenues. But 2021 was relatively fine. Then the war hit, and everything changed. Flat prices of crude rose significantly. Product cracks rose significantly, especially those cracks that Russia is exporting a lot of. So like diesel in that case. Other products were also having problems because, as you can imagine, it's always a closed system. So if you ramp up one product, you have to cut another one, so you're creating artificial imbalances in the system every time there is something that is causing one product to gain competitive advantage over the rest of the barrel, if you will. So the world was, or essentially West of Suez, was very much concerned about what's going to happen with the lack of Russian material going into Europe. Like a lot of people were concerned, will Russia continue trading with Europe at all? What will be the case? Will there be enough diesel? Which essentially sparkled a lot of the strength into crux and set up a much higher baseline than normal, which brings us to like the question of like you're asking here, how did Russia's state revenues look last year? They were indeed fantastic. They were from what we can gather, they were doing really well. Refinery margins, for one, have been triple compared to pre-war levels, and like in a way, Russia created a problem that it was able to solve. So in a way, it was a little bit of an artificial push to the domestic system. Even though they were selling at sizable discounts at face value, even these discounts were actually pretty palatable for the Russian state budget in terms of revenues. So not much has hampered Russia from collecting a lot of money. And I'm sure you've seen these reports. It's of course a little bit superficial, but probably there's some truth to that, like, why were people accusing India of financing the war in Ukraine, whereas in reality it was Germany that was one of the biggest financiers of the Russian state budget, together with other European countries, like the big importers of Russian hydrocarbons, Germany, Italy, to a degree France, UK. Like everything was business as usual. And bear in mind, Russia exports not only fuels, it also exports coal. Coal prices also rose quite significantly because the rise in natural gas prices caused a lot of problems in the European power system, which essentially sparkled a rally in coal prices. So in a way, the German reduction of Russian natural gas buying resulted in a pickup in coal buying, which really probably wasn't the case. So wasn't intended, to be honest. Of course, I cannot speak on the behalf of the German government or what they were up to. What I can speak on behalf of is that reports from the Russian central bank suggest that it was a very, very, very strong year in terms of state revenues in 2022, despite all the discounts that Russia was forced to implement across the board. What we are seeing now is the world sobering up to a new reality, if you will, because last year was very speculative, as you can imagine, in the sense that everything, like the world was preparing for rebound versus COVID levels in terms of consumption, in terms of economic activity. China was coming back, especially towards the latter part of the year. So before the war, it was a very optimistic environment. So it did take some time for the global economy to decelerate enough so as to adjust to the new reality of limited availability of fuels, high prices, and high inflation. And high inflation essentially led to the economic slowdown that we're living in now. It also created a lot of problems for consumers, and consumers, as you can imagine, are the biggest contributors to the Russian state budget. So low demand essentially means bad news for you if you are an exporter. And demand is low when economic times are hard. Economic times are hard when inflation is high. Inflation is high because of energy inflation, because of lack of supplies from Russia. Also, bear in mind, Russia is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, exporter of fertilizers, one of the biggest exporters of food globally, one of the biggest exporters of precious and industrial metals, coal as well. So all these commodities had to adjust to a new environment whereby Russia cannot adjust its supply chains to where it can find buyers, and supply chains cannot adjust to the lack of Russia in these deliveries. So prices had to come to rise. But of course, rising prices mean lower consumption, and lower consumption is the definition of or one of the defining factors before you hit recession. Once you hit recession, then everything deteriorates in the economic environment, and we are essentially living in this cycle of the economic performance right now. So right now, what we're seeing is that not only did we see demand struggling, so essentially whatever Russia and the world was able to accommodate in terms of high consumption is no longer there in terms of products, final products I'm talking about here. And also the other factor is that last year or last 2 years have seen sizable refinery capacity additions in other regions. So China, for one, added north of 600 KBD. That's almost 10% of the Russian refinery system in the span of 3 months at the end of 2022. India added another 100 KBD. Kuwait, Middle East added another north of 1 million barrels per day of primary processing capacity. So the world as a whole has become much more tilted towards higher supply, whereas demand started suffering. And the result of this is that we are now seeing refinery margins and respectively product cracks coming off. And coming off product cracks means only one thing: you are selling at a lower price. And if you're selling at a lower price, then state revenues suffer, because state revenues depend on the official selling price at which you realize your sales. So from that perspective, whilst it is true that last year was great and 40% off of a great year is still a pretty decent result, it's also true that Russia is having a lot of problems domestically, with loss of domestic business, with all the Western majors exiting the country. It's forced now to invest into trying to replicate their technologies to some degree successfully, but not very much, because it didn't have too much time to adjust to that. And second of all, it still has to finance a war, which, as you can imagine, is very costly endeavor. And you are seeing margins of refiners suffering because cracks are falling, which brings us to the topic of is the Russian state budget really suffering? Well, it is suffering because we know there's been this voluntary push from the Ministry of Finance across Russian businesses to make donations to the state budget. As much as we cannot substantiate the exact number, you don't do this in an environment where your economy is struggling unless you are desperate. The other thing is, and that's probably worth a mention here, is that the Russian tax system works in a way that if you produce road fuel, that is gasoline or diesel, you first and foremost should try to sell it on the domestic market. And to incentivize this, the government is paying you the price difference versus export markets, which has become one of the most sizable supportive factors for refinery margins last year. It still is to a degree. However, last week, the Ministry of Finance voted in the law that said this is going to be cut in half from 1st of July, regardless of the market conditions. So you don't do this if you don't have problems financing your own state expenses. Especially in an environment where your refinery system is struggling to find buyers now that essentially the West is out of the game, and you are selling at a discount across the board. Putting two and two together doesn't paint a particularly encouraging picture.
Yeah, and Andon, this is separate from the. I don't know if it's finally introduced as a law or if it was just a suggestion. But from what I understood, the way that the price of Urals, so the main benchmark crude for Russia is how the price is calculated for taxation purposes for Russian major companies has changed. This is a separate issue at this point, and that seems like it's also another, I mean, a telltale sign that the budget is not state revenue on oil and gas is not great.
The previous period when this benchmark price was calculated at Brent price of 85, the Ministry of Finance calculated the euros price at something like 48, if I'm not mistaken, $49 per barrel. Fast forward 1 month, prices of Brent, so the regional benchmark, fell by $5 to $10, and the states calculated that the euros price was actually 53, which doesn't make any sense.
Okay, because before this move, how exactly was the euros price calculated? It was essentially an average of transactions done on euros,
as reported by the international reporting agencies for the past. So from the 15th until the 15th of the current month, and by the end of the month, they calculate this price and set up the target for the next month.
How much do you think that the introduction of the, because we said, of course, you mentioned at the beginning that majors at the end of the day through these let's call them shenanigans, using shell companies, have kind of, let's say, have slowed their fall a bit, but indeed this will inevitably have an impact on Russian majors. How much do you think this is kind of a consequence of the actions that the European Union has taken in this sense, like price cap, and the various bans that have been introduced?
Well, the price cap. So I missed you for like 5 seconds due to connection issues. Is your question that is the price cap one of the factors that is cutting state revenues, or?
Or has this been such a significant impact? Has this had such a significant impact on revenue that in the end the Russian state kind of had to do this move of changing the taxation system?
No, I don't think so. Like, the price cap was set up at a higher price than what it would have ever been a realistic price for Russian products or crude. It's also so full of loopholes that I believe, as I mentioned at the beginning, the whole idea of the price cap has always been to just be more of a psychological factor rather than an actual financial strain to the Russian budget. Also, I mean, right now we are in an environment that could not justify the price cap to be reached by market forces in terms of flat prices, in terms of final reported prices. Will it happen again in the future that we'll get to that point? I don't know, maybe. But for what it's worth, it's a little bit of a long game here. That who are the big buyers of Russian crude and products? Turkey, Saudi Arabia recently, but the big guns are India and China. And
are they though? This is an interesting point, because I understand for crude, but I mean, of the products that Russia mostly produces, I'm thinking diesel. I mean, India, for example, is from what I know, is a net exporter. Or
India is not buying Russian diesel. India is buying
I
Russian
misunderstood.
crude. No, yeah. So essentially, what happens is that Russia sells record high levels of diesel to Turkey, and what happens is that the Turkish refinery system runs at normal rate. So whatever it produces, it exports to international markets at a premium, whilst buying Russian material at discount. So it's essentially a no-brainer for the Turkish state to capitalize on this situation. Other players in the Middle East are doing the same, and of course, there is the redirection of like countries that just need these materials. So Russia is selling stuff to Africa and to Latin America. That's like normal operations. But the big moving part is the crude stream, I would argue, in the sense that Russian crude is now allowing Indian refiners to be operating at pretty good margins, keeping Indian inflation very low, thereby fueling a very strong economic performance in India. It's also intermittently helping the Chinese state keep growth rates at somewhat healthy levels, I would say. Of course, China is a little bit more nuanced story. There is infrastructure in place via the Espo pipeline. It's also nearer because it's much easier to ship something from Vladivostok to Shanghai than it is to bring it from Primorsk to New Delhi. These are very long journeys that require more logistical power. So yeah, I mean, the long game here is that the US cannot do much about the China-Russia partnership, and the US does not want to lose India as a key player in the game of energy chess, because pushing India away from the Western alliances would mean bad news further down the line from the perspective of geopolitical repercussions. To a degree, same applies for Turkey, though probably a smaller degree because Turkey is just a smaller country. But in terms of like geographical location and its importance for Western alliances, it's not much less important. So the US, in a way, is turning a blind eye to these operations, thereby allowing them to happen. And yeah, I don't think this is going to end anytime soon.
Yeah, also because I wanted to point out and also to ask you, first, we have to say that the price cap applies only to seaborne, while we still have some pipes operating. And my question is how those operating pipes are still affecting Russia's cash flow. I mean, the pipes that are still working in the direction of Europe. And you mentioned logistical problems. I think about the difficulty that Russia has to build pipes with India and China. I've been reading about a gas pipe, Sila Sibiri, which, from what I understood, was built mainly on Russian money, and the Russians would have to pump gas for like 100 years to go break even. So yeah, two questions here: how the pipes that are still working that are still pumping oil and gas in Europe are affecting the Russian economy, and if it is possible that we will see in the future more pipes going through India and China and Turkey, maybe.
So gas is mostly out of the game by now because Nord Stream is down. This was the biggest stream. Ukraine flows are very much restrained, as you can imagine. So the major outlet for Russian gas remains Turkey to Europe. The problem is Turkey is also a big consumer. So for the most part, the gas story has actually become a great supportive factor for Azerbaijan, because it made the Caspian pipeline reality, and a big reality for that, especially for the big consumers in the Mediterranean. Case in point, Greece and Italy. So that's not much. There's not much there left. The power of Siberia, sure. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the news. I don't think there is that much more than that. Like the recent visit of Chinese President Xi to Moscow has resulted in this setup of long-term contracts of Russian gas exports via the power of Siberia to China that essentially sets the price at such a level that would hardly justify the investment, as you pointed out, for quite some time. Also, the big problem for Russia, or shall I say limitation to the partnership, is that power of Siberia is going into China's northern provinces that are not the big consuming centers. Big consuming centers are along the coast. So China is still very much a big LNG importer. It's not important to discount Russia's Turkmenistan and so. But in terms of the case in point, Russia-China, there's not that much to be expected there. A, the pipeline is limited in its scope, and B, the price is set up at a lower price level than would justify the investment. So it was more of a geopolitical move for President Putin to sign this contract, I would say, rather than economically justified one. As for gas, for oil pipelines, there is still the Druzhba pipeline that flows into Central Europe. It is operating. It's operating at much lower rates than it used to. There is no or very limited amount. I mean, it's still up for discussion, but put it this way, officially, there is no Russian gas going into Germany and Poland right now. Of course, what goes into the pipeline, no one knows. But it's a fact that the stream is much smaller than it used to be. Essentially, now it goes to Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Belarus, and Hungary. And of course, Belarus is at this point mostly if you will, de facto absorbed by Russia. So that's a little bit out of the scope of this discussion. So if you take out Belarus of the equation, then the pipeline is operating at roughly around a third of its capacity, which really isn't much. Are they paying normal euros price? Probably. That's up for the national companies and their Russian counterparts to discuss. But look, it's such a small stream that it cannot make much of a difference to the Russian state budget anymore. There's also the Bulgarian pipeline that is getting euros via the sea. That got the Burgas port got an exemption from the EU sanctions. We're talking about probably around 500-600 kbd of capacity. That's
so not relevant.
Around 10% of what Russia exports via sea.
Okay, we've lost you for a few seconds when you mentioned, if I heard correctly, Turkmenistan. One detail that I wanted to add, I've recently read about when you mentioned Azerbaijan, that Azerbaijan made a deal with Kazakhstan to essentially cut out Russia from their export system, their logistics system. If I've interpreted it incorrectly, you can correct me. But from what I understood, essentially, Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan signed a collaboration deal to export without the participation of Russia.
I have a hard time believing this is going to happen, to be honest, because I know Japanese companies have been looking into building the infrastructure in the Caspian Sea for shipping Kazakh material to Azerbaijan. Where will it come from? Because Kazakhstan has long-term contracts with China for the gas that it exports right now. Does it have that much additional gas capacity? Probably, but that would require also heavy drilling. As for oil, probably that too. You know, if they sign a contract, but bear in mind, like signing a contract doesn't mean anything for the next at least 2 to 3 years. By then, things might change dramatically. And for the here and now, it's largely irrelevant. Also, Kazakhstan has the benefit of also Azerbaijan to a degree, but because Kazakhstan is de facto landlocked and dependent on Russia, it also has the benefit of having a huge contract with Chevron for its upstream operations, and the Kazakh export stream of Novorossiysk in Russia has been unaffected, if not ramped up by the war, because no one wants to start a direct confrontation with the likes of Chevron in that case. Azerbaijan works with BP, also with a consortium of companies, so it also has the back, has its back covered by Turkey. So it's not like these countries are in such a unfavorable position. It's not that they can also make wonders within the next couple of years. There might be something, but it would require very heavy investment into that before we see it happening. Also, bear in mind the Caspian Sea, like there was a couple of years ago an agreement within all the Caspian states that they need to sign, all the states have to agree if there is any kind of any kind of infrastructure built on the seabed. So
essentially nothing gets ever done.
Yes. So the option for Kazakhstan is to build ports that can accommodate higher volumes of crude, and Azerbaijan to build ports, and everything to be exported via ships. You know, not impossible, a bit difficult, but doable. And then from then on, all this additional capacity has to go via the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline into the Mediterranean, which again requires heavy investments into an already built system. You know, not impossible, it just would require a lot of money, but for the right price, it might happen.
Yeah, I've just double checked, and there was a declaration of Kazakh President Tokayev, who said that Kazakhstan's plans to export hydrocarbons without help of Russia. So you think it is possible, but it's not very likely yet.
Yes.
Okay. And then
I mean, technically, Kazakhstan can detach itself completely from Russia even today. The only thing that is dependent on Russia is the access to the Novorossiysk port, which is guaranteed by contract between the two countries.
Okay.
Again, we're going a little bit deeper into the geopolitical game, but allow me to just open a bracket here. Like, Russia is running out of friends, and from the Russian perspective, do you really want to open a second front at your southern border that is more sparsely populated than your border with Ukraine. And this new potential, you know, not friend, so to say, rather than enemy, would be having the backup of both US and China.
Yeah, we also have to point out that that so far Kazakhstan has been a very precious friend of Russia. Like, they helped to avoid some sanctions. They tried like parallel imports, etc. So yeah, I agree with your assertion that Russia don't want to lose Kazakhstan as a friend. But yeah, if you wanted to add something to this, or otherwise we can move.
No, that's all. I think the major thing is that everyone now in the region will be trying to get to China. Yeah. So Russia and Kazakhstan are rivals in that regard. So it's not completely rosy picture between the two of them as well. Even considering that Kazakhstan has sizable Russian minority as well, and B, because they are too, as you point out, very interconnected. So none of them has a direct incentive into destroying the relationship with the other. Of course, unless something like the war in Ukraine happens there as well.
Yeah, sure. By the way, there is another very interesting topic that you already mentioned, but we would like you to elaborate a little bit on that. The so-called ghost fleet of Russia. So the shell companies, the boats that export and still ship Russian hydrocarbons in like avoidance of sanctions, like they don't respect price cap, etc. From what I can understand, some take the consequences, meaning they have like fines or something like that. If I'm wrong, correct me. Some other just are borderline illegal. And also a question on whether is it possible that Russia will go Venezuela style, meaning to put it briefly, Venezuela from sanctions on, they had some covering to their export, like they masked them up as crude of other provenience. Russia helped, by the way, Venezuela to like hide their hydrocarbons. So is it possible that Russia will do something similar? I don't think that in that proportion like Venezuela did it, because Russia exports way more, and I think it is impossible to hide all that stuff. But still, is some Venezuela style possible here?
Important clarification here is that the insurance and the fleet ban, or whatever, the price cap, it's a little bit loose in its implementation, as you can imagine. And also, a big chunk of the Russian hydrocarbons are now being shipped by Greek vessels. This is not in violation of EU rules. So there is this ghost fleet indeed, but should bear in mind that, like, in that regard, Greece is a key player into shipping Russian material outside of the country, and for the most part, this is not in violation of EU rules. So even if there is a tightening of the sanctions so as to cut Greece out of this game, Russia has enough gray fleet, or has accumulated enough gray fleet over the past months to be able to switch into them for the most part. As far as we understand it at Kpler, this ghost fleet or gray fleet has been utilized at a far smaller percent than initially thought. It's actually mostly Greek vessels that are shipping Russian material.
And sorry, Andon, these are not in violation of European rules because they're trading under price caps, essentially.
Officially, it's being sold under the price cap, and then there was some rule that it was like you are free to go if your vessel goes into quarantine or something like that for like a week or something. So it's very loose. And of course, if you are involved in that for a long time, then why not just capitalize on that for the time being and then think about the consequence after that? Because there is no way that like anyone is going to check if your vessel has ever touched any Russian material. And indeed, it's not in violation of EU rules at all. Like violation of EU rules is what it would have been if these barrels have touched European Union ports, which they never do. They charge from Russia. They travel through European Union territorial waters. Then they discharge in Africa or India or Turkey, and that's all. As for can Russia turn into Venezuela, I find it hard to believe because, as you say, it's too big to turn into Venezuela. It also has much more levers to save itself from the fate of Venezuela. There have been a lot of discussions about like the Russian downstream industry. Can it survive without Western technologies? Well, for the most part, it can. There is sufficient industrial complex in the country to maintain operations, and whatever they don't have at the moment, they can buy from Chinese counterparts, which is not in violation of any rules because, I mean, technically it's just trade between two countries under the World Trade Organization rules. And so Russia is, again, too big. It's a nuclear power as well. It has its biggest trade partner right next door, so it doesn't have to go through any seaborne operations to do anything. And it's also big enough to matter across various commodity markets so as to make a difference. What did Venezuela have? Venezuela had heavy crude. It also had relatively good, relatively large refinery industry, but it was stuck in the middle of a US-dominated region. So the only thing Venezuela could do was go under the radar and export crude to China. Russia is in a much different position. It has precious metals, it has industrial metals, coal, hydrocarbons, weapons, food, fertilizers. Indeed, Brazil is now becoming one of the big importers of Russian fertilizers, which is a major part of the Brazilian agricultural industry. And just opening a bracket here, if you're looking at it from the perspective of BRICS, the West is very supportive of its agricultural industries, so restraining imports from Brazil. Brazil is exporting agricultural products, and to do so, it needs fertilizers from Russia. So essentially, Brazil is in a very good position within BRICS, if you will, as an alternative to the Western-dominated trade unions. So it imports discounted diesel, discounted fertilizers from Russia, ramps up agricultural production, and then ships this agricultural production to China.
Understood. Yeah, no, it seems that in most cases it's always about some sort of triangulation. There's one way or another.
Yeah, I've also had another question that you, Andon, started to talk about. Well, can Russian economy survive in the current state of things? Meaning having China next door, having India not next door but pretty close, and still exporting fertilizers, as you said, still exporting weapons, still exporting coal, gold to those countries that haven't sanctioned. So many people say that one possible scenario is that Russia will become a giant Chinese colony, economically speaking, that it will be highly dependent on China, mostly dependent of China, on China. Like, for example, I often hear the example of North Korea, that Russia, can become a huge North Korea, or it still will trade, as you said, with BRICS countries, with Brazil, etc. So yeah, the main topic is how long do you think Russian economy can survive in the current state it is?
Well, it depends how you define economy. If you're defining economy as will the state budget remain in positive territory so as to finance its war, at least 5 to 10 years under most pessimistic scenarios, or optimistic, depending on your perspective. Can it sustain this status quo long term? Probably, because it's never been the objective of the Russian state to invest too much into the welfare state in the country or into the well-being of most of its citizens. What I'm getting at is that if you look at the Soviet Union, which arguably was a big different case because of the Warsaw Pact and the economic union in Central Europe, but the USSR has always been very heavily sanctioned, and yet it managed to project geopolitical power across the world by working with countries that were looking to get a leverage in negotiations with other players, which I don't think is not going to happen again. Like, we see the likes of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, India already, Pakistan, African nations, Brazil, willingly working with Russia. Unless there is some kind of a total destruction of the global trade paradigm, I don't think this is going to end anytime soon. Will it be a great place to live? Definitely not. It will be a horrible place for most people, but that's not the objective of the Russian state. The objective of the Russian state is to produce enough equipment to continue its war and to secure enough funds for the ruling minority, which they will, because simply by exporting commodities, you're generating huge profits. In a way, I think the allegory or the comparison with North Korea is interesting, but I think the closer comparison would be probably Nigeria.
Sorry, we've lost you for a few seconds. Last thing we heard was the allegory about North Korea.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say Russia's going to turn into North Korea, but I would probably expect it to turn into Nigeria.
Okay. So resource rich, which, with a very strong, let's say, ruling elite, which possesses most of the means of production, let's say, and exports than raw materials.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, well, the example of Nigeria is something new. I've never heard about that. Like, pretty often we hear Russia compared to North Korea, to Venezuela, to other countries. But yeah, Nigeria is an interesting example here. Yeah. So Gabriele, do you have some other questions? And most importantly, Andon, do you still have some time left?
Exactly 6 minutes.
Okay, Gabriele.
No, okay, then I don't think my question will the answer will last 6 minutes. It's a bit too expensive. Or unless unless Andon, maybe you can comment briefly. Has it been has there been any indication of changes in oil and gas production in terms of quantity? Let's say over the I mean, I know Rostat publishes some stuff. I mean, but is there any other indication of rise or fall of production of crude and gas? I'm thinking
crude processing is now working at around 10% lower baseline compared to pre-invasion levels. That's one thing. Russia made a pledge to cut crude production. So far, we've seen it not very well implemented. Gas is definitely falling. That we know already from Gazprom reports, which Gazprom controls 80% of the domestic gas production. So that's pretty much a given by now. Yeah, I mean, of course, if you are exporting something, if you don't have enough market for it, then you cut production. There's no way around it. But so far, like, Russia is finding easily buyers for everything it needs to find at home for, except for a couple of products. One of them is naphtha, the other one is video. But we didn't touch upon this too much, but let's put it this way. If you are aiming to produce enough gasoline for the domestic market, you end up with other products that you don't necessarily need. And then the global market doesn't necessarily need your products as well. So you are forced to reduce runs, otherwise you run into oversupplies domestically, which means you are destroying your margins.
Yeah, which kind of brings back to the point we raised at the beginning. I mean, now I have a clearer view, because essentially what before you used to export, now you produce less of, because you're running less.
Yeah, but to expect that Russia is going to collapse overnight is a bit premature. I think this status quo is going to remain in place for quite some time. If you allow me to open a little bit of a bracket here, we tend to think of the world as the countries that we have most interactions with, but outside of Europe and the Western alliances, there are close to 5 billion people who don't necessarily care too much about the ethical aspects of trading with Russia.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And
well, on this maybe a little bit sad / real political note, thank you, Andon, for your time. Thank you for this conversation. I hope our viewers will find it as interesting as we did. I think I can speak also for Gabriele. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you too. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you, Andon. And hoping to, I don't know, who knows, maybe this might become a regular collaboration.
Maybe, who knows.
Or at least from time to time.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, thank you, and thanks to all our viewers, and see you next time.
Thank you, guys. Thank you to all your viewers, and until next time.
Talk soon. Bye. Thanks.